Well, it's the untold story that most followers of Islam don't want you to hear. Thousands of Muhammad's disciples have become followers of Jesus Christ, and it's a trend spreading throughout the Islamic world.
From Africa to the Middle East to Asia, 49 Islamic nations are home to the majority of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims. That's nearly 1/4 of the world's population. For most of its 1,400-year history, the Islamic world has been closed and hostile to the gospel. But in just the last few decades, there's been a dramatic shift. Thousands of Muslims putting their faith in Christ. Researcher and author David Garrison explores the phenomenon in his book, A Wind in the House of Islam: How God is Drawing Muslims Around the World to Faith in Jesus Christ. Garrison asked 1,000 Muslim background believers one simple question: what did God use to bring you to faith in Jesus Christ?
Well, here's the book. It's called A Wind in the House of Islam, Dar al-Islam. And author David Garrison is here with us. David, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
How many interviews did you do? How far did you travel to get all this research?
Well, I traveled more than 250,000 miles.
Did you? Yeah.
One end of the Muslim world to the other, from West Africa to Indonesia.
Yeah.
Was able to gather more than 1,000 stories, interviews from Muslims who have come to faith in Christ, who are parts of movements of at least 1,000 in their community who've been baptized.
So you sit in this book, in order to count them, they've got to be at least 1,000 or 100 churches. Is it?
That's exactly right.
Okay. Well, now, how did you put the question to them, what brought you to faith in Jesus, and what was the answer?
Well, there were a lot of things that contributed to their coming to faith, but there was one common thread that ran through the stories from one end of the Muslim world to the other, and that was an encounter with the living Lord, with Jesus Christ. They met him. He changed their life. He became real to them.
What do you mean they met him? I mean, really met him? I mean, like live presence?
Well, in much the same way that we did.
Yeah.
There was something that came over them. In some cases, of course, it was dreams and visions. We've heard a lot about that, where Jesus broke into their dreams and visions. In other cases, it was an answer to a prayer, a sort of a taste and see that the Lord is good. And they had heard the story, they heard the gospel, sometimes through a broadcast, satellite radio, or through a missionary, or through a national Christian. And they had to see for themselves. So they prayed, and they said, if you're really there, and then fill in the blank, and Jesus showed up.
You had the story of the transformation and the Mount of Transfiguration, I should say. And they say this reflected their own experience.
Well, so many, it became so common for us to hear stories of Muslims who said, I saw this being in my dream, and he was like bright as the sun. He was shone with a white glow, and I couldn't make out who it was. And so rather than just tell them, oh, this was Jesus, which they might accept or reject, we would hand them a New Testament and let them point them to Matthew 17, verse 2, 1 and 2, where they would read the story of Jesus going up to the Mount of Transfiguration with his disciples. They would read it, and they would see, and Jesus was transfigured before them. They say, this is the guy. This is the one in my dreams. Who is this? And then they were on their way to discovering Jesus for themselves.
Have you ever figured out why is Jesus, he doesn't do that here in America very much to the standard Protestant Catholic Christian?
Well, you know, ever since, I think, since Sigmund Freud, we stopped listening to our dreams in the West.
Yeah,
you know,
okay.
we pass it off as bad pizza we got the night before.
Right.
But in the Muslim world, my concern is that maybe for 14 centuries they've been having these dreams. Dreams of someone reaching out to them, someone who they couldn't quite make out, and wondering who that someone was. And only now are they discovering that someone is, in fact, Jesus.
Do you think, I mean, they're descendants of Abraham, because that gives them a special claim on the promises. But is it their dedication? They are so dedicated to their religion.
Well, they are, and there's a lot of social pressure within their community that drives in that direction. You're not really given the latitude to be an unbeliever in the Muslim world. And so we found that oftentimes there's a veneer of commitment, but when you peel it back, there's a lot of dissension, a lot of dissatisfaction and unrest going on.
What is the principal cause of the dissatisfaction, have you found?
Well, Islam is a very oppressive religion. because there is so much stricture and structure. For example, if a Muslim decides he wants to go a different way and become a follower of Jesus Christ, well, there's a penalty for that, and the penalty is death. And so that pressure is creating there's a desire for freedom to decide for myself what it is that I believe and not just inherit what my culture gave.
They have a dream and they profess Jesus. That means that they're open game. They can be killed. Are they willing to endure that possibility?
You know, Pat, I interviewed leaders from all sectors of society, women and men. In one place, I had 20 gathered together in one place who were imams and sheikhs and leaders in their community. One of the fellows they pointed me to, they said, you know, he became a follower of Jesus several years ago. He's been baptized. He's teaching Jesus in the mosque, and he's trying to stay there as long as he can to win as many as he can. And he's actually, the leaders in the mosque said, you're teaching Christianity. You can't stay here. And they threw him out. He filed a lawsuit to be able to stay in the mosque. He said, I want to stay as long as I can until they kill me, because I want to win as many to faith in Jesus as I can before they take me.
You went into Indonesia, and you mentioned some of the things happening in Indonesia. Well, what did you find there? That's supposedly, quote, the largest Muslim country, but it really isn't.
Well, Indonesians have a long history of blending together various layers of religion. So if you dig down deep enough, you find animism, and then Hinduism, and then Buddhism, and then Islam. But what we're finding is a lot of people there are encountering Jesus Christ. You know, the largest turning of Muslims to Christ in history took place in Indonesia between 1967 and 1971, following the huge, what's been called the Year of Living Dangerously, 1965, when 500,000 Indonesians were murdered by other Indonesians. And as a result of that bloodbath and that hostility, many people who were Muslims nominally said, you know, if this is Islam, maybe I'm a Christian. 2.8 million were baptized in the years that followed.
Unbelievable. Now, you had in your book about Sukarno and Suharto, and that there was vicious fighting and killing.
There was indeed. In fact, it was an aborted communist coup. You remember those years.
Yeah.
We thought there was going to be a domino theory that would sweep through Southeast Asia, and Indonesia was in its wake, or in its path, and as a result, there was a violent reaction against communism, and anyone whose religion was ambiguous, they said kill them. And so people took this as an opportunity. They literally went door to door and just cut throats, cut off heads, assassinated enemies as well as people who were potentially communist.
Is there any country that just looks like it's the prime target of Christianity that you find right now?
Well, you know, the amazing thing about this, and I looked back over 14 centuries of Muslim movements to Christ to see, is this unusual today? What I found was 82 movements in the course of 14 centuries. Pat, 69 of them are happening today. So what's amazing is that we're living in the midst of the greatest turning of Muslims to Christ in history, and it's not limited to one place or another. It's literally spread from West Africa to Indonesia. Of course, Iran is the place that we hear about. That probably has the largest single turning today. So many Muslims in Iran are coming to Christ.
They can't stand those mullahs, the oppressive regime they have.
That's right. And that's a pattern we're seeing also. You know, when we see in the news the violence and the atrocities in the Muslim world, we need to realize that Muslims are also experiencing that, more so even than we are. And in many cases, it's drawing them to faith in Jesus Christ. They're looking for a better way, a different way. And so where there's violence, there's hostility, there's also the grace of the gospel.
Is it going to be a great upheaval, do you think, in the Muslim world? I mean, really an overthrowing where you find Christianity emerging in countries?
It's going to be tough.
Yeah.
Islam is the world's only major religion that was tailor-made really to defeat Christianity. And in fact, for about 13 centuries, it did a pretty good job. Tens of millions of Christians have been assimilated into the Muslim world. It's only now that we're beginning to see these outbreaks. And frankly, Pat, they're still tiny. I mean, out of 1.6 billion Muslims, we're looking at a minuscule, just a tiny little beginning point.
Yeah.
But if it continues, if this pattern continues, this could be the beginnings of something wonderful.
Well, we hope so, and the book is called A Win in the House of Islam. You ought to get a copy of it. It's very well done and extraordinarily detailed, and our brothers trek across that vast plain. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Pat. God bless you.